There is a street in Detroit where ghosts live in marble hallways, where chandeliers still hang from ceilings that no one has looked up at in decades, where grand pianos sit silent in parlors thick with dust, their keys yellowed, their music long forgotten. This is the story of Billionaire Row, the magnificent stretch of mansions that once housed the kings of the American automobile industry, men whose names still echo through history: Ford, Dodge, Fisher, Packard. They built empires of steel and glass, and they built homes to match. Palaces that rose along the shores of Lake St. Clair and the tree-lined avenues of Detroit's most exclusive neighborhoods. For a brief, brilliant moment in history, this city was the richest in America, perhaps the richest in the world. And these mansions were proof of that wealth. Monuments carved in limestone and brick, filled with treasures from Europe and dreams as big as the factories that funded them. But empires fall, industries shift, and sometimes the very symbols of greatness become symbols of something else entirely. Today, many of these mansions stand empty, their windows dark, their gardens wild, their stories almost forgotten, almost. Because behind every crumbling wall and rusted gate, there are tales of ambition, betrayal, love, and loss that still deserve to be told. To understand how Detroit became a city of abandoned palaces, we must first understand how it became a city of kings. The story begins not with automobiles, but with a simple question that changed everything. What if a machine could replace the horse? In the final years of the 1800s, that question obsessed inventors across America and Europe. Steam engines were too heavy. Electric batteries couldn't hold enough charge. But there was another possibility: a small, efficient engine powered by gasoline. In 1896, a 32-year-old engineer named Henry Ford built his first horseless carriage in a small brick shed behind his Detroit home. He called it the quadricycle. It had 4 bicycle wheels, a simple steering tiller, and an engine that sounded like an angry sewing machine. His neighbors thought he was crazy. His employer, the Edison Illuminating Company, was concerned. But Henry Ford didn't care what anyone thought. He had seen the future, and it moved on 4 wheels. Ford wasn't alone. Across Detroit, other dreamers were tinkering in workshops and barns. The Dodge brothers, John and Horace, had started as machinists building bicycle parts before they began manufacturing components for the new automobile industry. Ransom Olds created the first mass-produced automobile, the Oldsmobile, in 1901. And a young businessman named William Durant was already imagining something even bigger. A company that would bring together multiple automobile manufacturers under one roof. He would call it General Motors. What made Detroit special wasn't just that it had inventors. Every city had inventors. What made Detroit special was that it had everything the automobile industry needed to succeed. Iron ore from the mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, coal from Appalachia, timber from the vast northern forests. The Great Lakes provided cheap transportation for raw materials, and the city's existing industries, carriage making, shipbuilding, and machine shops, provided skilled workers who understood metal, wood, and precision manufacturing. By 1910, Detroit had become the automobile capital of the world. Factories stretched for miles along the Detroit River. Smokestacks filled the sky with the gray breath of progress, and money, more money than anyone had ever seen, began flowing into the pockets of the men who owned those factories. This is where our story of mansions truly begins. Because when ordinary men become extraordinarily rich, they do extraordinary things. And in early 20th century America, Nothing said success quite like a magnificent home. The auto barons didn't just want houses, they wanted statements. They wanted to build monuments to their achievement, proof that a boy from a Michigan farm or an immigrant machinist from Ireland could rise to rival the old money aristocrats of New York and Boston. They wanted palaces. The first great mansion district emerged in a neighborhood called Boston Edison, named for two of its main streets. Starting around 1905, wealthy Detroiters began building elaborate homes on wide, tree-lined boulevards just north of the city center. The houses here weren't the largest in Detroit, but they were among the most beautiful. Tudor revivals with steep, gabled roofs and half-timbered facades. Colonial mansions with towering white columns. Mediterranean villas with red tile roofs and sunny courtyards. Each home was unique, designed by the city's finest architects for clients who wanted their neighbors to know exactly how well they had done. Among the earliest residents was Henry Ford himself. In 1908, the same year he introduced the Model T, Ford purchased a modest but elegant home on Edison Avenue. The house had 14 rooms, which might sound grand until you compare it to what would come later. But Ford was never comfortable with excessive display. He preferred his wealth to be measured in factories and employees rather than chandeliers and ballrooms. Still, even his relatively modest Edison Avenue home featured hand-carved woodwork, imported tile, and gardens designed by some of the finest landscape architects in the country. Ford would live there for nearly a decade before moving to his estate at Fair Lane. But the Boston Edison neighborhood retained its prestige long after he left. A few blocks away, another automotive pioneer was building something far more extravagant. Sebastian Kreska, who had made his fortune in retail before investing heavily in the automobile industry, constructed a mansion so large it occupied an entire corner lot. The house featured a grand ballroom that could accommodate 300 guests, a private conservatory filled with exotic plants, and servant quarters that were nicer than most middle-class homes. Kresge threw legendary parties where Detroit's elite gathered to celebrate their success. Chamber orchestras played while guests danced beneath crystal chandeliers. Champagne flowed like water from the Detroit River, and through the tall windows you could see the glow of the factories in the distance, the source of all this wealth, working through the night. But the true palaces, the homes that would define Billionaire Row in the public imagination, rose along the shores of Lake St. Clair, east of downtown Detroit along Jefferson Avenue. Here, where the land curved gently toward the water and the views stretched for miles, the auto barons built their grandest monuments. The Fisher Mansion stands as perhaps the finest example of what money and imagination could create in 1920s Detroit. Lawrence Fisher was one of 7 brothers from a small Ohio town who had built their fortune manufacturing closed automobile bodies. Before the Fisher brothers revolutionized the industry, most cars had open tops. Passengers were exposed to wind, rain, and cold. The Fishers developed lightweight, affordable, enclosed bodies that transformed the automobile from a fair-weather novelty into an all-season necessity. General Motors eventually bought their company for nearly $200 million, an almost incomprehensible sum at the time. With his share of that fortune, Lawrence Fisher hired the finest architects and craftsmen available to build a home unlike any Detroit had ever seen. Construction began in 1927 on a site overlooking Lake St. Clair. For 2 years, hundreds of workers labored to bring Fisher's vision to life. The mansion covered more than 30,000 square feet. Its exterior blended Mediterranean and Moorish influences, with arched doorways, wrought iron balconies, and a red tile roof that seemed to glow in the Michigan sunset. but the exterior was merely a prelude to the wonders within. Step through the carved mahogany doors, and you entered another world. The great hall soared 2 stories high, its walls covered in hand-painted murals depicting scenes from mythology and history. Gold leaf adorned nearly every surface. The ceiling featured intricate plasterwork that had taken Italian craftsmen months to complete. A grand staircase swept upward, its marble steps worn smooth by generations of footsteps, or at least they would have been if the family had stayed long enough to wear them smooth. Every room was a masterpiece. The dining room featured walls paneled in rare woods brought from 3 continents. The library held thousands of leather-bound volumes behind glass cases trimmed in sterling silver. The music room contained not just a grand piano, but an entire pipe organ built into the walls. And the bathrooms, there were dozens of them, featured fixtures plated in actual gold. Not gold-colored, gold. Perhaps most remarkable was the natatorium, a private indoor swimming pool enclosed in a room of such beauty that swimming almost seemed beside the point. Tile mosaics covered the walls and floor, depicting dolphins, seahorses, and mermaids in vivid blues and greens. The ceiling was painted to resemble a twilight sky, complete with golden stars and a crescent moon. Underwater lights made the pool itself glow like liquid sapphire. In summer, the Fisher family and their guests would swim while servants brought cocktails and the sounds of a jazz band drifted in from the terrace. The mansion cost nearly $3 million to build. In today's money, that would be well over $50 million. And Lawrence Fisher filled it with treasures from around the world. Tapestries from medieval France, sculptures from Renaissance Italy, Persian rugs so fine they had taken weavers years to complete. Paintings by old masters hung beside modern works by artists who were just beginning to earn recognition. Every object was the finest money could buy, chosen not just for its beauty, but for what it said about the man who owned it. Lawrence Fisher had risen from a working-class family to the heights of American industry, and his home would reflect that journey. Just a few miles down the lake shore, another automotive dynasty was building its own monument. The Dodge brothers, John and Horace, had died within months of each other in 1920, both struck down by the influenza pandemic that swept the world. But their widows and children continued the family legacy of spectacular homes. Rose Terrace, built by Anna Dodge on the shores of Lake St. Clair, was perhaps the grandest private residence ever constructed in Michigan. The original mansion, completed in 1910, was already impressive, but after her husband's death, Anna hired the architect Horace Trumbauer to design something even more magnificent. The new Rose Terrace, completed in 1934, looked like it had been transported from 18th century France. Its facade was inspired by the Garden Pavilion at Versailles, with tall arched windows, classical columns, and formal gardens that extended to the water's edge. Inside, Rose Terrace contained 88 rooms, including a 2-story music room with a pipe organ, a ballroom that could accommodate 500 guests, and private apartments for Anna and her children that were larger than most houses. The furnishings had been collected from the great estates of Europe. Chandeliers that had once hung in French palaces now illuminated Michigan evenings. Furniture that had belonged to Marie Antoinette sat in rooms overlooking the Detroit skyline. It was said that Anna Dodge spent more on decorating Rose Terrace than most people would spend on buying and furnishing 100 normal homes. The parties at Rose Terrace were legendary. Anna Dodge entertained presidents, European nobility, and the leading figures of American business and culture. Her guest lists read like a who's who of 20th century power and privilege. Yet for all its grandeur, Rose Terrace had a melancholy undercurrent. Anna was a widow in her 40s when she began building the house. She would live there for nearly 50 years, but much of that time was spent alone. Surrounded by servants and treasures, her husband and many of her friends long since gone. The mansion that was meant to celebrate life became, in many ways, a monument to loss. A few miles inland, a different sort of wealth was creating a different sort of neighborhood. Palmer Woods, developed beginning in 1917, was designed from the start to be an exclusive enclave for Detroit's new millionaires. Unlike Boston Edison, where homes had been built individually over time, Palmer Woods was a planned community. Its curved streets, mature trees, and generous lot sizes were carefully designed to create an atmosphere of country estate living just minutes from downtown. The homes of Palmer Woods represented the full range of architectural imagination. Tudor mansions stood beside Spanish colonial villas. Georgian colonials looked across the street at arts and crafts bungalows. Each house was required to cost at least $10,000, a fortune at the time, ensuring that only the wealthy could afford to live there. And the wealthy came in droves. Auto executives, parts manufacturers, dealership owners, and the lawyers, doctors, and financiers who served them all made their homes in Palmer Woods. One of the most impressive was the residence built by Edsel Ford, Henry's only son. Edsel had grown up in his father's shadow, but he was in many ways the more refined of the two. Where Henry was practical and sometimes crude, Edsel appreciated art, design, and beauty. His Palmer Woods home reflected that sensibility. It was elegant rather than ostentatious, with clean lines and carefully proportioned rooms that showcased his growing collection of modern art. Diego Rivera murals would later hang in his Grosse Pointe estate, but even his earlier homes revealed a sophisticated eye that his father never developed. By 1929, Detroit had more millionaires per capita than any other city in America. The automobile industry had created wealth on a scale never before seen in human history. In just 3 decades, Detroit had transformed from a modest Midwestern city into a glittering metropolis where dreams came true and fortunes were made overnight. The mansions of Billionaire Row were proof of that transformation, monuments to American ingenuity and ambition. Their builders genuinely believed they were founding dynasties that would last for generations. They imagined their grandchildren and great-grandchildren living in these homes, inheriting not just wealth, but a way of life. They were wrong. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression began. The automobile industry, which had seemed unstoppable, suddenly struggled to survive. Sales plummeted, factories closed. Workers who had earned good wages building Model Ts and Buicks found themselves unemployed and desperate. The soup lines that formed in Detroit stretched for blocks. The mansions of Billionaire Row didn't empty overnight. Many of their owners had diversified their wealth enough to survive the initial crisis. But the Depression changed something fundamental about America's attitude toward ostentatious wealth. The grand parties stopped. The European buying trips ended. Families that had employed dozens of servants quietly reduced their staffs, and the mansions themselves, those magnificent monuments to success, began to feel like embarrassments in a nation where millions were going hungry. Some families held on through the Depression and the Second World War that followed. The auto industry recovered, and Detroit once again became a city of manufacturing might. But the world had changed, and the neighborhoods of Billionaire Row changed with it. The children and grandchildren of the auto barons often had different priorities than their ancestors. They moved to newer, more modern homes in the suburbs. They converted family mansions into apartments or donated them to institutions, and some simply walked away, leaving the homes their grandfathers had built to decay in the Michigan winters. The story of what happened next, the decades of decline that transformed Detroit's grandest homes into symbols of urban abandonment, is perhaps even more dramatic than the story of their creation. It is a story of racial tension and white flight, of industrial collapse and political corruption, of dreams deferred and promises broken. And through it all, the mansions of Billionaire Row stood witness, their empty windows staring out at a city that had forgotten how to dream. But that story must wait. For now, let us linger a moment longer in the golden age, when the chandeliers still blazed, and the parties still swirled, and the men who built America's automobiles believed their empires would last forever. Let us walk one more time through the marble halls of the Fisher Mansion, or stand on the terrace at Rose Terrace watching the sunset paint Lake St. Clair in shades of gold and rose. Let us remember what was before we face what became. Because in the end, the story of Detroit's Billionaire Row is not really about houses at all. It is about America itself. About the heights we can reach and the depths to which we can fall. About the price of progress and the cost of forgetting. And about what remains when the money runs out and the parties end and the silence settles over rooms that once rang with laughter. The ghosts are still there, waiting in the darkness. Their stories are far from finished. But before the silence came, there were more mansions to build, more dreams to chase, and more characters whose lives would become intertwined with the fate of Detroit itself. Consider the story of the Packard family, whose name became synonymous with automotive luxury. James Ward Packard had built his first automobile in 1899 in Warren, Ohio. The Packard Motor Car Company became known for engineering excellence and impeccable craftsmanship. Their vehicles were the choice of presidents and kings, Hollywood stars and industrial titans, and the wealth that flowed from those sales-funded spectacular homes in Detroit. The Packard family's residence on Jefferson Avenue embodied everything the brand represented: elegant rather than flashy, sophisticated rather than showy. The house was built of warm brick with limestone trim, its Georgian architecture suggesting old money stability rather than new money exuberance. But inside, every detail had been executed to perfection. Door hinges that operated in absolute silence, window glass so clear it seemed to disappear. The Packards built their home the way they built their cars, with an obsessive attention to quality that accepted nothing less than the best. Not far away, in the Indian Village neighborhood, another collection of mansions was taking shape. Indian Village had been established in the 1890s as a streetcar suburb, its streets named for Native American tribes. By the 1920s, it had become one of the most desirable addresses in Detroit. The homes here were somewhat more modest than the lakefront estates, but they were no less impressive in their own way. They represented a different vision of wealthy living, one that emphasized community and neighborhood rather than isolation and exclusivity. The streets of Indian Village were lined with mature elms and maples that formed a canopy overhead, dappling the sidewalks with shade in summer and carpeting them with gold and crimson in fall. Children from wealthy families rode bicycles past houses designed by the same architects who worked on the grandest estates. There was a sense of permanence here, of roots being put down, of families committed to building not just houses but a way of life. The auto industry's growth seemed limitless in those years. By 1925, Detroit was producing nearly 4 million vehicles annually. The city's population had exploded from less than 300,000 in 1900 to over 1.5 million. Workers poured in from across America and around the world, drawn by wages that were higher than anything they could earn elsewhere. Henry Ford's famous $5 day had transformed the American economy, creating a middle class that could afford to buy the very products they were manufacturing. New technologies made the homes of the 1920s even more luxurious than their predecessors. Central heating systems meant that families no longer needed to cluster around fireplaces in winter. Electric lighting banished the shadows that gas lamps had left in corners, and automobile garages, often heated and appointed like living spaces, replaced the carriage houses of the previous generation. The parties of the 1920s reached heights of extravagance that would never be matched. At one memorable gathering at the Fisher Mansion, guests arrived to find the grounds transformed into a Venetian carnival. Gondolas floated in the swimming pool, poled by servants in period costume. Italian singers serenaded from balconies decorated with thousands of flowers imported from California. The food was prepared by chefs brought in from New York, and the wine had crossed the ocean from France in violation of prohibition laws that nobody in this crowd took seriously. But even in these glory days, there were hints of troubles to come. The very success of the automobile industry was changing the city in ways that would eventually undermine the neighborhoods of Billionaire Row. As factories grew larger and more numerous, pollution darkened the skies, and the automobile itself, the source of all this wealth, was making it possible for people to live farther from the city center than ever before. The first wave of suburban development had already begun. Grosse Pointe was being subdivided into estates that rivaled anything on Billionaire Row. Birmingham and Bloomfield Hills, to the north, were attracting families who wanted more land and fresher air than the city could provide. The auto barons themselves were not immune to this suburban pull. Henry Ford had abandoned his Boston Edison home for Fair Lane, a massive estate in Dearborn. Edsel Ford would eventually build Gawkler Point, a lakefront estate in Grosse Pointe Shores. Even the Fishers were acquiring properties outside the city limits. Still, in 1929, the mansions of Billionaire Row remained occupied and vital. Their gardens were immaculately maintained. Their interiors sparkled, and their owners still believed that Detroit's golden age would last forever. They could not know that within months everything would change, that the stock market crash of October 1929 would begin a cascade of failures that would reshape American society, that the industry that had made them rich would nearly destroy itself before recovering, and that their magnificent homes, built to last for generations, would become casualties of forces none of them could have foreseen. The chandeliers still burned bright that autumn. The parties still swirled, and somewhere in the distance, the factories still hummed through the night, building the future one automobile at a time. But the future, as it turned out, had other plans. The crash came on a Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. A day that would forever be known as Black Tuesday. On Wall Street, stock prices that had seemed to climb forever suddenly plummeted. Fortunes that had taken lifetimes to build vanished in hours. And in Detroit, the auto barons watched as the foundations of their empires began to crack. At first, many believed the crisis would pass quickly. The wealthy had weathered economic storms before, but this was different. This was a collapse that would reshape American society for generations. Within months, automobile sales had fallen by more than half. Factories that had operated around the clock suddenly went silent. The smokestacks that had once filled the sky with the breath of progress now stood cold and still. The mansions of Billionaire Row did not empty overnight. Their owners had diversified enough to survive the initial shock. But the Depression changed something fundamental about how Americans viewed ostentatious wealth. The grand parties stopped. The servants were quietly let go, one by one. Families that had employed dozens of staff found themselves managing with just a handful. And the treasures that had once been shipped from Europe, the paintings and sculptures and antique furniture, stopped arriving. There was no money for such things now. And even if there had been, it would have seemed obscene to buy them while millions starved. Inside the Fisher mansion, the swimming pool that had once glowed like liquid sapphire sat empty and dry. The mosaics of dolphins and mermaids stared up at nothing. In the grand dining room, the table that had seated 40 guests now hosted only Lawrence Fisher and his immediate family, eating modest meals in a room designed for banquets. The pipe organ in the music room fell silent. Who could play music at a time like this? At Rose Terrace, Anna Dodge maintained appearances as best she could. She was a widow now, her husband John having died in 1920, and she had built this palace partly to honor his memory. She would not abandon it. But even she was forced to make economies. The staff shrank. The gardens grew simpler. The endless round of entertaining that had defined her social life slowed to a trickle. The 88 rooms of Rose Terrace began to feel less like a palace and more like a mausoleum. The Depression lasted more than a decade. By the time it finally eased, the world had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The Second World War brought the automobile factories roaring back to life. But now they were building tanks and jeeps and aircraft engines instead of luxury sedans. Detroit became the arsenal of democracy, and the city's population swelled once again, with workers seeking the high wages that war production offered. But these new workers were different from those who had come before. Many were African Americans from the rural South, part of the Great Migration that was reshaping American cities. They came seeking opportunity, escaping the brutality of Jim Crow segregation, and they found both promise and prejudice in the Motor City. Detroit's housing was strictly segregated. Black families were confined to a small area of the city, packed into overcrowded neighborhoods where housing was scarce and expensive. The mansions of Billionaire Row remained in white neighborhoods, but those neighborhoods were changing. The children and grandchildren of the auto barons had different priorities than their ancestors. They didn't want to maintain 30,000 square foot palaces. They didn't want to manage staffs of servants. They wanted modern homes with modern conveniences, and increasingly, they wanted those homes in the suburbs. The 1950s saw the beginning of what would become known as white flight. Families who had lived in Detroit for generations began moving to the new subdivisions sprouting up in Oakland and Macomb counties. Grosse Pointe, Birmingham, Bloomfield Hills. These communities offered larger lots, newer schools, and most importantly to many residents, escape from the increasingly diverse city. As white families left, the old mansion districts began to change. Some of the great houses were subdivided into apartments. Others were sold to institutions, churches, or schools. A few were simply abandoned, their owners unable to sell them and unwilling to maintain them. The mansions that had been built to last for generations began their long decline. The Fisher Mansion was among the first to find a new purpose. In 1943, Lawrence Fisher sold the estate to the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. The Hare Krishnas, as they were popularly known, transformed the mansion into a temple. The swimming pool where flappers had once splashed became a sacred bathing place. The dining room where champagne had flowed became a vegetarian kitchen. The music room where jazz had played now echoed with mantras and the ringing of bells. It was an unlikely transformation, but perhaps a fitting one. The mansion that had been built as a monument to material success became a monument to spiritual seeking. The Krishnas maintained the property with care, preserving much of its original beauty while adapting it to their needs. Visitors could still marvel at the gold leaf and the murals, even as monks in orange robes walked the halls where servants had once hurried. But not all the mansions found such caring stewards. Many fell into hands that did not have the resources or the inclination to maintain them. The great houses of Boston Edison, which had once been home to the cream of Detroit society, were particularly vulnerable. As the neighborhood changed, property values fell. Families who bought the mansions often couldn't afford the astronomical costs of heating, maintaining, and repairing them. Roofs leaked. Furnaces failed. Plaster cracked and fell in sheets from ceilings that had been painted with scenes of angels and clouds. One by one, the grand homes of Boston Edison began to show their age. Paint peeled from elaborate trim. Windows broke and were boarded over. Gardens that had been tended by teams of gardeners grew wild and tangled. The wide boulevards that had once been lined with gleaming automobiles now held rusting cars that hadn't moved in years. The 1967 rebellion accelerated the decline. On a hot July night, police raided an after-hours club on 12th Street, just a few miles from the mansion districts. The African-American community, long subjected to police brutality and economic discrimination, erupted in anger. For 5 days, Detroit burned. 43 people died. More than 7,000 were arrested. And entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The mansion districts themselves were largely spared the worst of the violence. But the psychological impact was devastating. White residents who had been considering leaving now fled in panic. Property values collapsed. Insurance companies refused to write policies. Banks refused to make loans. The neighborhoods that had once represented the pinnacle of American success became symbols of urban decay. Through the 1970s and 80s, Detroit's decline continued. The auto industry that had built the city was hemorrhaging jobs to foreign competition and automation. Japanese manufacturers, with their efficient production methods and reliable vehicles, captured market share that American companies had considered unassailable. The big three automakers closed factory after factory. The population, which had peaked at nearly 2 million in 1950, began a precipitous fall that would eventually cut the city in half. Crime rose as opportunities vanished. Neighborhoods that had once been safe became dangerous after dark. The middle class, both black and white, fled to the suburbs, leaving behind those too poor or too old to move. The tax base shrank, and with it the city's ability to provide basic services. Schools deteriorated. Streets went unpaved. Garbage collection became sporadic. Detroit, the city that had once represented the future of America, became a symbol of urban failure. The mansions of Billionaire Row aged with the city. Rose Terrace, which Anna Dodge had maintained until her death in 1970, was demolished in 1976. The 88-room palace, with its French furniture and crystal chandeliers, was simply too expensive to maintain. No buyer could be found who was willing to take on such an enormous property. The wrecking ball reduced it to rubble in a matter of days. The treasures inside were auctioned off, scattered to collectors around the world. The gardens that Anna had tended for nearly 50 years were paved over for a condominium development. It was as if the house had never existed at all. The demolition of Rose Terrace sent shockwaves through historic preservation circles. If one of America's grandest homes could simply be erased, what hope was there for lesser mansions? The answer, as it turned out, was not much. Throughout the 80s and 90s, mansion after mansion met its end. Some were deliberately demolished by owners who couldn't sell them and wouldn't maintain them. Others simply collapsed under the weight of neglect, their roofs failing, their walls surrendering to decades of water damage. In Boston Edison, houses that had cost fortunes to build were abandoned for unpaid property taxes. The city took possession but lacked the resources to maintain them. They sat empty, their windows dark, their roofs slowly failing, waiting for a salvation that never came. The stories of individual houses during these years read like obituaries for a vanished way of life. The Kresge Mansion, where chamber orchestras had once played for 300 guests, was subdivided into apartments in the 50s. By the 80s, it was a rooming house, its grand rooms partitioned with cheap drywall. By the 90s, it was abandoned entirely. Vandals stripped the copper pipes and wiring, selling them for scrap. Thieves took anything of value, from doorknobs to light fixtures. Rain poured through holes in the roof, and the grand ballroom floor buckled and warped until it was dangerous to walk on. The murals that had taken artists months to paint faded and peeled, ruined beyond restoration. In Palmer Woods, the decline was slower but no less real. This neighborhood, with its curved streets and generous lots, retained more of its original character than most. But even here, the mansions showed their age. Families who had inherited them often couldn't afford the maintenance. A new roof on a 12,000-square-foot house could cost more than a modest home in the suburbs. Foundation repairs, boiler replacements, window restoration, the bills never stopped coming. Some owners made heartbreaking choices. They closed off entire wings of their homes, heating only the rooms they actually used. They watched as plaster fell from ceilings they couldn't afford to repair. They covered beautiful hardwood floors with carpet to hide the damage. They became prisoners of their own inheritances, trapped in houses that consumed every dollar they earned. The Indian Village neighborhood fared somewhat better, thanks largely to the dedication of its residents. Here, neighbors organized to maintain their community. They held house tours to raise awareness and funds. They created strict guidelines for renovation and maintenance. They fought against proposals to demolish historic homes or subdivide lots. Their efforts saved many houses that would otherwise have been lost. But even Indian Village couldn't escape the broader forces reshaping Detroit. The 2008 financial crisis hit the city particularly hard. The auto industry, which had seemed finally to stabilize, suddenly tottered on the brink of collapse. General Motors and Chrysler required government bailouts to survive. Ford barely avoided bankruptcy, and thousands of auto workers lost their jobs, their pensions, their homes. In 2013, Detroit became the largest American city ever to declare bankruptcy. The city's debts exceeded $18 billion. Basic services had deteriorated to the point of dysfunction. Streetlights didn't work. Police response times stretched to nearly an hour. Entire neighborhoods had been essentially abandoned, their houses standing empty and crumbling. The bankruptcy revealed the full extent of the devastation. City officials estimated that there were more than 70,000 abandoned structures in Detroit. Many of them were modest homes, but among them were mansions that had once been the pride of Billionaire Row. Houses that had cost millions to build were now worth less than the cost of demolishing them. Yet even in this darkness, seeds of renewal were being planted. A new generation of Detroiters, many of them young artists and entrepreneurs drawn by low rents and a pioneer spirit, began to see possibility where others saw only decay. They bought abandoned houses for a few $1,000s and spent years restoring them. They started urban farms in vacant lots. They opened restaurants and galleries and tech companies in buildings that had stood empty for decades. Some of the mansions of Billionaire Row benefited from this revival. The Fisher Mansion, still owned by the Hare Krishnas, became a destination for visitors curious about both its architectural beauty and its spiritual transformation. Tours now wind through the same rooms where Lawrence Fisher once entertained automotive royalty, guides explaining both the original grandeur and the religious significance of its current incarnation. The gold leaf still gleams, the murals still tell their ancient stories, and the swimming pool, though long dry, still dazzles with its mosaics of mythical sea creatures beneath that painted twilight sky. In Boston Edison, a few dedicated owners have brought their homes back from the brink. They have spent years and fortunes restoring plaster and refinishing woodwork, replacing windows and rebuilding chimneys. They have learned the names of craftsmen who haven't worked in a century, tracking down specialists who know how to replicate terracotta ornaments or repair leaded glass. Their efforts have begun to stabilize the neighborhood, attracting new buyers who see the potential in these magnificent structures. Property values have started tentatively to rise. There is even a waiting list for some of the finest homes, something unimaginable just a decade ago. Palmer Woods has become something of a success story. The neighborhood association remains active and vigilant. Houses that might have been demolished elsewhere have been painstakingly restored. Tours of the neighborhood's mansions attract thousands of visitors each year, bringing attention and revenue to a community that has managed to maintain its character against long odds. But the losses cannot be undone. Rose Terrace is gone forever, replaced by condominiums that bear no trace of the palace that once stood there. Its chandeliers now hang in museums and private collections across the country. Its furniture has been scattered to the winds. Only photographs remain to prove how magnificent it truly was. Dozens of other mansions have met similar fates, demolished or collapsed, their treasures scattered, their stories largely forgotten. The Billionaire Row that once defined Detroit exists now only in fragments, individual houses standing like survivors of a catastrophe, surrounded by the ghosts of their vanished neighbors. Walk through these neighborhoods today, and you will find a strange mixture of grandeur and decay. Here, a mansion fully restored, its gardens immaculate, its windows gleaming. There, just a few doors down, a house that hasn't been occupied in 20 years, its roof collapsed, its walls slowly surrendering to the Michigan winters. The contrast is jarring, almost painful. It raises questions about wealth and responsibility, about preservation and progress, about what we choose to save and what we allow to disappear. The auto industry that built these mansions has changed beyond recognition. The factories that once stretched for miles along the Detroit River have mostly been demolished or converted to other uses. The workforce that built millions of cars has shrunk to a fraction of its former size. Electric vehicles and autonomous driving threaten to disrupt the industry yet again. The future, as always, refuses to stand still. And yet, something of the old spirit survives. Detroit remains a city of makers, of people who believe in the power of hard work and innovation. The entrepreneurs who are rebuilding the city's economy share something with the auto barons who came before them, that unshakable conviction that they can build something great, that tomorrow can be better than today. The mansions that remain are monuments to that spirit. They remind us what Americans can achieve when ambition meets opportunity. They remind us, too, of the costs of success, the inequality it creates, the tensions it generates, the fragility of even the greatest fortunes. Standing before the Fisher Mansion today, you can still feel the weight of history. The carved mahogany doors still open onto the great hall with its gold leaf and painted murals. The staircase still sweeps upward toward bedrooms that once housed automotive royalty. The swimming pool, dry for decades, still dazzles with its mosaics of mythical sea creatures. It is beautiful and melancholy in equal measure, a palace that outlived its purpose, a dream that refused to disappear entirely. In the end, the story of Detroit's Billionaire Row is a story about time, about how quickly fortunes can be made and how quickly they can vanish, about how the monuments we build to celebrate our success can become monuments to our failure, about how every gilded age must eventually end, leaving behind only stones and memories and questions that we may never fully answer. The ghosts of Billionaire Row still walk their halls. In the creak of old floorboards and the rattle of drafty windows, you can almost hear their footsteps. They built palaces because they believed their empires would last forever. They were wrong about that. But perhaps they weren't wrong about everything. Perhaps the beauty they created, the craftsmanship they commissioned, the ambition they embodied. Perhaps these things have value beyond their original purpose. The mansions that survive are being loved again, by new owners who see in them not just history, but possibility. They are being restored, room by room, year by year, by people who understand that preservation is an act of faith, an act that says the past matters, that beauty is worth saving, that even a crumbling palace can be redeemed. Detroit itself is being reborn, slowly and imperfectly, by people who refuse to accept that decline is destiny. The empty lots are filling in with new construction. The abandoned factories are finding new uses as lofts, breweries, and tech incubators. The population, after decades of relentless decline, has finally stabilized and even begun to grow in the downtown core. There is cautious hope in the air, the first such hope in a generation. And in the mansion districts, the survivors of Billionaire Row stand as witnesses to it all. They have seen the rise and the fall. They have known glory and neglect, celebration and abandonment. They have watched generations come and go, each one leaving its mark on walls that have stood for a century. They are patient, these old houses. They have learned to wait. Perhaps one day all the mansions that remain will be restored. Perhaps the neighborhoods will regain their former elegance, if not their former exclusivity. Perhaps Detroit will rise again to take its place among America's great cities, its architecture celebrated, its history honored, its future bright. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the forces of decay will prove too strong. Perhaps more mansions will fall one by one, until only photographs remain to prove they ever existed. The future, as always, is uncertain. But this much is certain. The story of Billionaire Row is the story of America itself. The heights we can reach, the depths to which we can fall, the resilience that allows us to rise again, and the eternal, unresolved tension between creation and destruction, between building and abandoning, between the dreams we chase and the reality we inherit. The chandeliers that still hang in these old mansions have seen it all. They have blazed with light during celebrations and hung dark during decades of neglect. They have witnessed history pass beneath them, year after year, generation after generation. They are still there, waiting in the shadows, ready to shine again if anyone cares enough to light them. And somewhere, in the silence of an abandoned ballroom or the echoing emptiness of a forgotten library, the ghosts of the Auto Kings are waiting too, waiting to see what we will do with the legacy they left behind, waiting to see if we will remember them, honor them, learn from them, waiting to see if the palaces they built will survive another century, or if they will finally surrender to time. The story of Detroit's Billionaire Row is not finished. It will continue as long as the houses stand, as long as people care enough to preserve them, as long as anyone remembers what they represented and what they lost. It is a story written in stone and mortar, in gold leaf and leaded glass, in the fading grandeur of rooms that once held the richest men in America. It is, in the end, a story about us, about what we value and what we discard, about what we build and what we allow to crumble, about the choices we make and the consequences we inherit. The mansions of Billionaire Row asked a question with every room they built. Was it worth it? A century later, we are still searching for the answer. The ghosts are patient. They have all the time in the world. And the story they tell, of ambition and loss, of glory and decline, of dreams that soared and dreams that shattered, is a story that will echo through these halls for as long as they stand. Listen carefully, and you can almost hear them whispering. This is what we built. This is what we lost. This is what remains.